My wife was gone for 14 days. She told her sister she was finding herself. She told her mother she was at a work retreat. She never told me anything at all. When she finally walked back through our front door with a suitcase full of resort tags, I didn't yell. I didn't ask where she'd been, or who she'd been with, or why. I asked her one single question. She opened her mouth to answer it. Nothing came out. And that silence told me everything I needed to know about the next 3 years of both our lives. My name is Nathan Reed. 3 years ago, I would have told you I had a good life. Not a perfect one, a good one. The kind you build slowly, one ordinary Tuesday at a time, until one day you look up and realize you've made something solid. I was 34. I'd been married to Allison for 6 years. We met in college, dated for 4 more after that, and got married in a backyard with string lights and a borrowed sound system. People used to say we were the couple that made other couples feel better about their own relationships. Not because we were flashy, because we were steady. Allison worked in marketing for a regional healthcare company. I helped run my father's restaurant on weekends while working my own job in logistics during the week. We had a small house with a crooked fence I kept meaning to fix. We had a life that fit us. Then my father got sick. It happened fast. 1 month he was flipping burgers on the line himself because he refused to let anyone else touch the flat top on Friday nights. 3 months later, he was gone. Heart failure, the doctors said, though I think some of it was just decades of standing on his feet 12 hours a day so his family could eat. I inherited more than grief. I inherited a restaurant that had been losing money for 2 years, a stack of unpaid vendor invoices, a walk-in freezer that needed replacing, and 6 employees who had worked for my father since I was in high school, and who all looked at me like I was the only thing standing between them and unemployment. I threw myself into it. I had to. There was a mortgage on the building. There was a staff with families. There was my father's name on the sign out front, and I wasn't going to be the son who let it get repossessed 6 months after the funeral. Allison noticed the change immediately. Of course she did. I went from a man who came home at 6 every night to a man who came home at 9, smelling like fryer oil, exhausted, distracted, doing inventory spreadsheets at the kitchen table instead of watching television with her like we used to. "You've become obsessed," she told me one night, about 4 months in. "It's like the restaurant is your marriage now." I remember apologizing. I remember promising it would get better once I hired a manager. Once the books were stable. Once I figured out how to keep my father's legacy alive without losing myself in the process. I meant every word of it. I just didn't understand yet how little time I had to prove it. Looking back, I think that's the part that still gets me. I wasn't ignoring her because I didn't love her. I was drowning in responsibility and doing the best I could to keep my head above water. And I genuinely believe she could see that. I believe she was frustrated, but patient. I believed we were a team working through a hard season the way every couple eventually has to. I was wrong about that. I just didn't know it yet. The first crack showed up on a Thursday in March. Small. Almost nothing. Allison mentioned casually, over a rush dinner of reheated pasta, that she'd been assigned a new project partner at work. A guy named Derek Voss, from the regional office. She said his name the way you'd mention a new coworker you barely know. Flat, unremarkable, a footnote in a sentence about deadlines. "He's actually really good at keeping projects organized," she said. "Not like the last guy." I nodded. I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? People have coworkers. People compliment coworkers. It was one sentence in a conversation that was mostly about a broken dishwasher and whether we could afford to fix it before summer. But I remember, even then, some small quiet part of me noticing the way her face changed when she said his name. Just slightly. Just enough that if you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it entirely. I wasn't paying attention. Not really. I had a walk-in freezer to replace and a staff meeting at 7 the next morning. I filed the name away without realizing I was filing anything at all. That was the first wrong note. A name mentioned too casually. A face that shifted for half a second. Nothing you could point to. Nothing you could prove. Just the very first thread in something that would take months to fully unravel. And I had no idea, sitting there with my cold pasta and my spreadsheets, that I'd already started pulling on it. I want to be fair to that version of myself, sitting at that kitchen table. I wasn't a fool, because I missed the signs. I missed the signs because I trusted the person across from me completely. That's not weakness. That's what a marriage is supposed to feel like. A place where you don't have to run background checks on every sentence your spouse says over dinner. I'd built 6 years of evidence that Allison was someone I could trust with my whole life. And one slightly too casual mention of a coworker's name wasn't going to undo 6 years of evidence in a single Thursday. Besides, I had other things pulling at me. The restaurant's health inspection was coming up, and I'd found mouse droppings in a storage closet the week before that needed remediating before the inspector ever set foot in the building. 2 of my father's oldest line cooks were threatening to quit over a scheduling dispute I hadn't fully untangled yet. My mother kept calling, still raw with grief, needing someone to talk to about probate paperwork neither of us understood. I was one person, trying to hold up a restaurant, a grieving family, and a marriage, all at the same time, and something in that structure was always going to be the first to crack under the weight. I just assumed it would be me. I never imagined it would be her. Small things started piling up the way small things do. Not fast enough to alarm you, just fast enough that if you added them up months later, you'd feel like an idiot for missing the pattern. Allison started working later. That wasn't unusual on its own. Marketing had quarterly pushes, and I was hardly one to complain about long hours, given my own schedule. But these late nights had a different texture to them. She'd come home already showered, hair still damp, even though she said she'd been at the office. She'd laugh at her phone, and then put it face down the moment I walked into the room. Small things. I told myself they were nothing. Then her phone got a passcode. It had never had one before. When I asked about it, almost joking, she said something about corporate security policy for anyone who accessed work email on a personal device. I remember thinking that was a strange policy for a regional marketing team, but I let it go. I was tired. I had 100 other things pulling at my attention. Payroll, a health inspection, a walk-in freezer installation that had run 3 weeks behind schedule. Derek Voss's name kept surfacing. Not dramatically, just constantly, in the background, the way a name does when someone has become a bigger part of your spouse's daily life than you realize. Derek thinks we should pitch it differently. Derek's covering for me Friday. Derek says the client loved the deck. One night, she came home wearing a perfume I didn't recognize. When I mentioned it, she said she'd tried a new sample at the mall. I complimented it, genuinely, not thinking twice. It was 2 weeks later, doing laundry, that I found a receipt in her jacket pocket from a boutique perfume counter. Dated a full month before the night she said she'd just tried a sample. I told myself I'd misread the date. I told myself I was starting to see things that weren't there because I was stressed and guilty about how much time the restaurant was eating out of our marriage. That's the cruelest part of this kind of situation. If you've never lived through it, you start doubting your own perception before you start doubting the person you love. I actually apologized to Allison, unprompted, for being paranoid one night, after asking an innocent question about her schedule. She accepted the apology gracefully. Too gracefully, maybe. At the time, I just felt relieved. The restaurant, meanwhile, was finally starting to turn a corner. We'd stabilized the books. I'd hired a kitchen manager I trusted. For the first time in almost a year, I had a few actual free evenings. I thought that meant things between Allison and me would get easier too. I planned a weekend trip for the two of us. Nothing extravagant, just a cabin 2 hours away, the kind of place we used to go before my father got sick. She said she couldn't. Work retreat, she told me, mandatory, regional office, off-site, 3 days, no cell reception at the venue. I remember being disappointed but not suspicious, until I mentioned the trip, in passing, to her coworker Marissa at a mutual friend's barbecue a few weeks later. Marissa looked confused. What retreat? We didn't have anything that weekend. I laughed it off in the moment, made some joke about corporate scheduling chaos, and changed the subject before Marissa could see how hard my hands had suddenly started shaking around my drink. That night, I didn't confront Allison. I told myself I needed to be sure before I said anything, that I owed her the benefit of the doubt after everything we'd built together. But something in me had shifted permanently. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't let myself before. I noticed the pattern of her late nights mapped almost exactly onto Derek's schedule, which she mentioned without realizing I was tracking it. I noticed she'd started keeping her laptop with her at all times, even to the bathroom. I noticed she flinched, just slightly, every time my phone buzzed near hers. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, an email notification popped up on the shared family tablet we kept in the kitchen. An account she must have forgotten was still logged in on that device. A hotel confirmation, 14 nights. A resort 2 states away, 2 guests. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time just looking at it. 14 days, 2 guests. A confirmation number I hadn't been part of booking. I didn't say anything to her that night. I didn't say anything the next morning either. I just watched her pack a suitcase 3 days later, kiss me on the cheek, and tell me she was heading to a leadership summit in another city. The same dates, I now knew, as the reservation on that tablet. I stood in our driveway and watched her car pull away, and for the first time in our entire marriage, I didn't believe a single word that had come out of her mouth in months. The house was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. 14 days is a long time to sit alone with proof you haven't fully let yourself look at yet. I didn't call her. I didn't text her demanding answers. Some instinct in me, maybe grief-trained patience from watching my father fight a slow, losing battle without ever raising his voice about it, told me that if I confronted her from anger, she'd manage the story. She'd control the narrative the way she'd clearly been controlling it for months. I needed the truth first. The confrontation could come later. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I opened the joint credit card account we still shared for household expenses. The one she probably forgot still sent me email alerts. 14 days of charges told a story more complete than I wanted. A resort in a coastal town neither of us had ever visited together. Room service charged to the room twice a day. A couple's spa package. A dinner reservation for 2 at a restaurant with a 5-star rating and a name that sounded like the kind of place people go to celebrate something. I found the hotel's public website. I found photos of the resort, private villas, ocean view suites. The kind of place that costs more per night than what we used to spend on an entire vacation. I found, on a public event board buried in the resort's social media tags, a photo posted by another guest at a shared pool bar. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was Allison laughing, her hand resting on the forearm of a man I recognized immediately from a company directory photo I found with one more search. Derek Voss, there it was. Not a suspicion anymore, not a receipt I could talk myself out of. A photograph, timestamped, geotagged, undeniable. I sat at our kitchen table with my laptop open for almost 2 hours that night, just staring at it. I want to tell you I felt rage. Mostly I felt something quieter and heavier than rage. I felt like a fool. I thought about every late night I'd apologized for missing. Every I'm sorry, work's just been insane, I'd offered her over the past year, feeling guilty for the hours the restaurant demanded of me, while she was quietly building an entire second life 14 states away with a man from her regional office. I thought about my father, too. About the last thing he'd told me before he died, lying in a hospital bed that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. He'd grabbed my hand and said, "Don't let anything you build fall apart because you were too scared to look straight at it." At the time, I thought he meant the restaurant. Sitting at that kitchen table with the photos still open on my screen, I understood he might have meant something bigger than that. I had every reason, in that moment, to call her, to scream into the phone, to demand she come home immediately and explain herself. I didn't do any of that. Instead, I closed the laptop and I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to react yet. I wasn't going to give her the version of this confrontation where she got to see me break down in real time, where she got to manage my emotions the way she'd apparently been managing everything else about our marriage for months. I was going to wait. I was going to let her come home believing she'd gotten away with it clean. And then I was going to ask her exactly one question, a question with no trap in it, no accusation, nothing she could spin or explain away. A question simple enough that only the truth or a lie could answer it, and I would know immediately which one I was hearing. I also, in those first raw hours after finding the photo, did something I'm not particularly proud of but don't regret either. I called the resort directly, pretending to be confirming details for an anniversary surprise, and asked a front desk employee to confirm the names on the reservation. She read them back without hesitation, having no idea what she was actually confirming. Allison Reed and Derek Voss, 1 room, 14 nights, checkout the following Sunday. Hearing a stranger's voice say both their names together, so casually, so administratively, did something to me that the photograph alone hadn't quite managed. It made it real in a way that facts on a screen sometimes can't. I thought briefly about calling Derek's wife, because I'd since learned, through the company directory and a little more digging, that he had one, along with 2 young kids listed as beneficiaries on an old company newsletter photo from a family picnic 2 summers back. I decided against it, at least for the moment. Not out of mercy for Derek. I simply didn't yet know how this was going to unfold, and I wasn't going to set off consequences for other innocent people until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. For the remaining 11 days of her leadership summit, I went to work. I went to the restaurant every night and helped close down the kitchen with a staff that had no idea their boss's entire personal life was quietly falling apart behind his calm face. I fixed the crooked fence in our backyard, finally, after 2 years of meaning to. I cleaned the house. I even, in a strange act of controlled grief, went through old photo albums of Allison and me from before we were married, trying to understand at what exact point the woman in those photos had become someone capable of what I now knew she was doing 2 states away. I didn't find an answer. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe people just become different people over enough time, and you don't notice until the gap between who they were and who they are has grown too wide to bridge. On the 14th day, her car pulled back into our driveway a little after 4 in the afternoon. I watched her get out, stretch, pull a suitcase from the trunk, sun-kissed, relaxed, lighter than she'd looked in months. She walked up the front path with the easy confidence of someone who believed completely that she had gotten away with something. I opened the door before she could knock. She smiled at me on the doorstep. A real smile, warm, like she'd genuinely missed being home. I almost admired the performance. Almost. "Hey, stranger," she said, rolling her suitcase past me into the front hall. "I'm exhausted. That summit ran us into the ground. I need a shower and about 12 hours of sleep." I let her get settled. I didn't say a word about the hotel charges, the photo, the 14 days of a story I already knew was false from the first sentence. I made dinner. I asked about her flight home, listened to a completely invented account of breakout sessions and keynote speakers that had never happened, and I nodded along like a man who believed every word of it. That night, after she'd unpacked and settled onto the couch with a cup of tea, I sat down across from her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of anything. I just looked at her, calm and steady, and I asked the one question I'd been holding on to for 11 days. "Did you ever miss me while you were gone?" It's such a small question. Any faithful spouse could answer it in half a second, without even thinking. Allison opened her mouth to answer it, and then she stopped. Her eyes moved, just slightly, the way they do when someone is searching for a lie solid enough to hold weight and finding nothing. The silence stretched on for what felt like a full minute. She never actually answered. Not with words, anyway. Her face answered for her. That silence was worth more to me than any confession could have been. A confession is something someone gives you because they've been caught. That silence was the truth arriving entirely on its own, with no pressure, no accusation, nothing but one honest question she couldn't lie her way through. I stood up, told her I was going to sleep at the restaurant that night, and I left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say another word. I just walked out, got in my car, and drove. What followed over the next few weeks wasn't a screaming match or a messy public fight. I'm not built that way, and honestly, I didn't need to be. I met with a lawyer quietly and started the legal groundwork for a separation. Clean, methodical, nothing dramatic, everything documented. I didn't need to expose her to the world. I didn't need revenge in the way people usually mean it. I needed my life back, built on something real instead of a story I'd been telling myself for the better part of a year. Allison, for her part, didn't take the separation with any grace. Within weeks, she was dating Derek Voss openly, no longer hiding a single part of it. At a mutual friends gathering that I happened to hear about secondhand, she reportedly told people I had chosen a dead restaurant over my marriage, rewriting the entire last year of my life into a story where my grief and my responsibility to my father's legacy were the villain, and her 14-day resort trip with a coworker was somehow a reasonable response to it. I let her have that story. I didn't correct it publicly. I didn't need to. I had something better than an argument I could win in a group chat. I had time, and I had work I actually believed in. I threw everything I had left into the restaurant. Not out of obsession this time, but out of purpose. I renegotiated supplier contracts. I trained a management team that could actually run the place without me standing over every shift. I opened a second location 18 months later, in a neighborhood 2 towns over that had been begging for a decent family restaurant for years. The third location opened the year after that. What had been my father's single struggling restaurant became, over 3 years, a small regional chain with his name still on every sign, doing better business than it had in a decade. My relationship with my mother and my sister, which had gotten strained during the chaos of settling the estate, slowly repaired itself too. Sunday dinners came back. Real ones, not the exhausted, distracted version I'd been showing up to during that first terrible year. Allison's relationship with Derek, meanwhile, didn't hold up the way she'd probably expected it to. I heard, through the same mutual friends who used to relay her comments about my dead restaurant, that things between them had gotten rocky, distant. The kind of relationship that had been thrilling as a secret and disappointing once it had to survive in the daylight. About 2.5 years after our separation finalized, she started reaching out to me again. Small things at first, a birthday text, a comment on something she'd heard about the third restaurant opening, then longer messages, then a phone call, her voice sounding smaller and less certain than I remembered it. I let her back into my life, carefully, and I let her believe, for a little while, that something between us might still be possible. Building those next 2 locations wasn't the fairy tale montage it might sound like from the outside. There were nights I sat in the office above the second location doing payroll by hand because our new software kept crashing. Nights I drove 40 minutes at 11 p.m. because a walk-in compressor had failed, and $3,000 of inventory was on the line. There were arguments with contractors, a supplier who tried to quietly raise prices mid-contract, a health inspector at the second location who failed us on a technicality I had to fight for 2 weeks to get overturned. None of it was glamorous. All of it was mine, built with my own hands and my own decisions, answerable to no one but myself, and the family name still hanging above the door. That mattered more to me than I expected it to. For the first time since my father died, I wasn't managing a crisis. I was building something on purpose, with a clear head, without the constant low hum of guilt and confusion that had followed me around during that first terrible year of the marriage. Grief and heartbreak, it turns out, can either bury you or clarify you, and somewhere in that second year alone, I chose clarity. I had no idea, walking into that reunion, just how much further this story still had left to go. I want to be honest about something. When Allison started calling again, part of me wanted the reconciliation to be real. Not because I'd forgotten what happened, I hadn't. But 3 years is a long time, and some old stubborn part of me still remembered the woman from those early photo albums. The one who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives before either of us had any idea how complicated life would eventually get. We started meeting for coffee, then dinner. She told me Derek had moved on with someone else almost a year earlier, quietly, without much explanation. She told me she'd had a lot of time to think about what she'd broken. She told me she wanted to try, slowly, to earn something back. I let her. I wasn't naive about it. I kept my own life exactly as it was, my own apartment, my own schedule, my own guarded heart. But I gave her room to show me who she was now, 3 years removed from that resort and that silence on the couch. For a while it looked like she meant it. She showed up to a family dinner at my mother's house and helped clean up afterward, without being asked. She asked real questions about the business, about the new locations, about the staff she used to roll her eyes at for taking up all my time. I started to believe, cautiously, that people really can change if they're given a large enough consequence to learn from. Then, about 4 months into this slow rebuilding, I noticed something familiar. A phone that stayed face down, a new gym membership with suspiciously specific hours, a girl's trip that, when I mentioned it in passing to the one friend of hers I still occasionally talked to, turned out to not exist at all. I felt something in my chest go cold and very, very calm. Not devastated this time. I'd already survived devastation once, and it had built me a business and a repaired family and a life I was genuinely proud of. This time, I just felt certain. I didn't investigate for weeks like I had before. I didn't need to relearn a lesson I'd already paid full price for. I simply asked her, directly, over dinner one night, whether there was someone else. And this time, she didn't go silent. This time, she told the truth almost immediately, like the weight of maintaining a second lie had exhausted her faster than the first one ever had. There was someone new, a man from her gym. It had been going on for about 2 months. I nodded. I wasn't angry. I think, if anything, I felt something close to relief. The relief of a question fully and finally answered. with no more ambiguity left to sit with. I told her I wanted her to see something before we ended things for good. I brought her to my newest restaurant location, the one that had opened just that spring, the busiest of the three. With my father's name still glowing on the sign out front, a line of customers waiting on a Friday night for a table. I showed her the private dining room upstairs, currently booked for my sister's engagement party the following month. I showed her a framed photo near the entrance of my father on opening day of the very first location, decades ago, and a newer one beside it of the whole current staff, a team that had become something like a second family to me. This is what I built, I told her. In the 3 years since you asked me to choose between a dead restaurant and my marriage, turns out it wasn't dead. And turns out I didn't need you here for any of it to grow. She didn't have a response for that. Not really. Just like she hadn't had a response for the question on the couch 3 years earlier. Around the same time, word reached Derek, through whatever remained of their old shared social circle, about Allison's new relationship. He hadn't fully moved on the way she'd claimed. He'd apparently held on to some hope of his own that things between them might eventually work out again. When he found out about the man from the gym, he cut off contact with her completely and, from what I heard, told several mutual acquaintances exactly why. So there she was. The coworker who had helped end my marriage now wanted nothing to do with her. The husband she'd left standing in a driveway with a question she couldn't answer had built a life 3 times the size of anything they'd had together entirely without her. Both men she'd built her story around had walked away, in the end, for the exact same reason. Because trust, once spent carelessly enough times, doesn't come back just because you're finally ready to ask for it. I heard much later from a mutual friend that Allison had told someone at a dinner party that leaving me had been the biggest mistake of her life, and that the man who used to seem so consumed by a struggling family restaurant had actually been quietly building the most stable, successful, connected version of himself the entire time she'd been chasing something she thought was better. I don't feel triumphant about any of it, honestly. I just feel like a man who finally got to stop holding his breath. These days, my life looks almost nothing like it did back in that first exhausting year after my father passed. The restaurants run themselves most days without needing me on site every shift. I still show up on Friday nights sometimes, just to stand at the pass for an hour the way my father used to, because it keeps me close to why I started any of this in the first place. My sister's engagement party filled that private dining room to capacity, and I stood in the back near the kitchen doors and watched my family laugh together in a room with my father's name on the wall. And I thought about how far we'd all come from those first brutal months of probate paperwork and grief. I don't know what happened to Allison after that dinner, where I showed her the second location. I heard secondhand that she moved to a different city about a year later. I don't think about her often anymore, which is its own kind of ending. Not bitter, not triumphant, just quiet. The kind of quiet you only get once a question has been fully and finally answered, with nothing left unresolved underneath it. Sometimes the most satisfying ending isn't watching someone get destroyed. It's watching them finally receive the bill for everything they broke, and realizing there's no one left willing to pay it for them. That's all for today on Cheating Lady Files. Like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, would you have walked away this calmly?